Alright, for those of you who've been watching my pragmatic swordsmanship videos and any of my other general ramblings on the subject of martial arts, I always throw in the same sets of caveats. And caveat number one always is I don't consider myself any kind of master, expert, anything like that. Now, in today's video, well, maybe y'all can play a game. How many times am I going to repeat this statement? Because, oh boy, does it apply. But a recent comment on my cold steel Talwar, my initial review of that sword, I realized, well, that was back in the time when I wasn't doing these sort of stand-up handling demonstrations. And if you're not prepared for what a Talwar can do and what it can't do, yeah, you might be in for a bad time if you try to use this as you would use, well, say a Western saber or a Chinese Dao, or, yeah, even apply it like you would a katana. It's very, very, very different, but I find it quite fascinating. However, caveat one, there's another repetition, I have very little training with this. So basically what I'm hoping to do here is encourage you to look up videos from, well, far more qualified practitioners than myself, and if you do, you're going to be pretty impressed by what you see. It's pretty amazing stuff. But what I'll try to do is just kind of show you how this particular sword handles in the context of someone who's, you know, just working with it for a fairly short period of time, and comparing it to how I work with, well, all the other swords I work with. And hopefully I'll be able to give you something useful, or at least, shall we say, a little better forewarning if you're thinking about buying a Talwar and you're not sure what you're getting into. Okay, in the review of the sword, which I did just after having it for a few days, I mentioned that I had great success cutting with it. And it handled very well for me, but that's because I was already familiar with, well, basically how a Talwar works. You know, I'm not an expert in any way, shape, or form. I'm not terribly good at it, but these concepts were already in my head, as well as a couple of exercises I'm going to show you that may or may not be helpful. Again, not an expert. How many times am I going to repeat this? Anyway. Weight, balance, length of blade for me is very comfortable, especially if I'm using it in close quarters. And this is definitely a close quarters sword compared to what you might be used to, and I'll show you that here in a second. But, you know, the major issue is the design of the grip. It is, well, I have tiny hands, and even this one that's designed for Western hands, it's pretty tight in there. It really locks your hand in, and it may squish your hand if you have a bigger, meatier hand than I do. An original and antique is going to be even tinier than this, so be aware if you're going to look for something on the antiques market. Yeah, they're very tight grips, notoriously so. Also, you will have to get used to, you may or may not be used to, a cast metal grip. You may not find that comfortable or positive enough, or you may not like the way it's engraved or shaped. Yeah. It does have that palm swell. I like it, you might not like it, but the big thing, of course, is the disc. And from that video, show you a bit of a close-up here, I did realign the disc. It is no longer crooked. It didn't take a whole lot of work, so that was a fairly easy fix. Now, the huge difference is how it mandates that you wield it compared to other kinds of swords. You really, really have to maintain a hammer grip with the sword at probably much more of a right angle to your arm than you're used to. Now, this is going to affect thrusts and cuts. Being able to make Western style or even Chinese or Japanese style cuts that are more from the wrist or that have a longer reach, yeah, that's not happening. But as I've mentioned in other videos, I'm a short guy with short arms, and I am comfortable with fighting at very close range. So that makes this appeal to me in other ways. However, your ability to move this thing around without this disc, cutting into your hand and basically warning you that you're out of bounds is, yeah, something that takes a while to get used to and may not be natural, comfortable, or appealing to you. It is to me. Let me give you a little bit of insight. First of all, you'll notice that as I'm moving this through cutting patterns, it is pretty close to me, and there is a lot more emphasis on a draw cut or sometimes a short chop, but it comes very much from the whole arm with the hammer grip maintained at all times. If I'm going to thrust with this thing, I talked about this a little bit in Chinese swordsmanship. I consider thrusting movements that come more straight from the wrist, in line with the arm, versus a stabbing action, which is more from a hammer grip at a right angle. Yeah, these are going to be stabbing actions that, as you can see, are actually not too bad for getting around corners, but they don't have the same kind of body mechanics, having your arm straight behind the blade as a thrust. And they're certainly not going to have the same reach, and it may be very difficult for you to learn how to aim a stab like that. But again, at very close range, they can be incredibly effective. Long range, well, not so much. It's not really what it's built for. Parrying, well, if you're familiar with how sabers and similar weapons parry, one-handed swords, it's not terribly different. You can usually pull off most of your close body parries. Now, it's not going to parry like a rapier or a longer reach weapon like that, but for weapons that you're used to keeping close to your body and parrying, it's going to be pretty close. There are going to be some similarities in techniques, but again, you're going to have to make some fundamental changes to your mechanics, or this thing is basically going to punish you for stepping out of bounds. Let's take a look at a couple of exercises that might help you adapt. Again, I'm not any kind of expert or even any good at Indian swordsmanship, Shastra Vidya or Gatka, and recommend you immediately look up people that are to get much better advice than I can give you. One exercise that I picked up uses not the sword but the stick to develop not only the wrist and arm strength but the specific mechanics of being able to use the Talwar without it, well, punishing you with that disc pommel. Now, they will stick fight, and there are other cultures that do this too, where they hold their weapon, whether it's a stick or a blade with a very long handle, so there's a whole lot south of your hand, and they make that work in various ways. Again, I'm not an expert. You can certainly look this up on YouTube. But there is a tool that they'll use, which is basically a stick with either weights or just wooden balls on either end of varying lengths. Now, this one, for instance, is 4.5 feet. This is just one of the Joe staffs that I use for Japanese martial arts. I'll show it a little bit, but I don't have a lot of room, and then I'll demonstrate with, well, something shorter. So pretty much any wood dowel, 3 feet, 4 feet, or whatever you want to use that's kind of shaped the same way. The idea is there are staff exercises like this in other kinds of martial arts, where if you grip it in the middle with one hand, think about how you can move this around you without basically hitting yourself, usually with the bottom end of it. So yeah, there are patterns that you can utilize, and there are patterns that you can't utilize. This will, at least for me, it helps me. I'm not an expert, not really any good at this. It helps me train myself to be able to figure out what the proper patterns are for being able to move the Talwar. Free myself up a little bit by using a short one. Even this, just because you've got a thing sticking out the bottom here, gives you that sense that, yeah, I have to maintain a hammer grip. Not totally right angled, but pretty close, for doing whatever technique it is I'm going to do. And that's parrying, cutting, all sorts of different kinds of maneuvering, whether I'm thinking about actually trying to hit with this in a chopping motion or more of a draw cut motion, lining it up for a thrust. Yeah, this has helped me understand the mechanics of the Talwar quite a bit. So that would be one of my recommendations if you pick one of these up or decide you want to try to learn it and you're really kind of not getting it, it's really hurting you. Try working with a stick. And again, refer to people who are much more educated and experienced about this than I am. What else could you potentially do? Again, I'm not an expert master and I'm not really very good at this at all, but a couple of sword exercises that I picked up specific to this weapon that again have helped me, and they're actually great physical training for all different kinds of swordsmanship, and you may see some similarities to what you're already doing. Two I want to show you. One is the around the head cut, and there is a version of this in Chinese Dao saber, but also close range cutting exercise. Now, the around the head movement was one of the primary ones that was trained and demonstrated for power cutting with Indian swordsmanship. If you think about the history of British imperialism in India as they were recruiting and training local troops to maintain their empire, they had to be trained in a lot of British things, British weapons and tactics and formations and things like that. But one of the things even the British had to admit is they needed no training whatsoever in the use of a sword. They actually accepted straight up that the Indians were a lot better with a saber than they were. So, respect. Now, one of the primary demonstrations is to bring the weapon horizontal. You're going for basically a neck cut, neck level cut, but you're bringing it around from the shoulder, body, waist. And you'll notice from the side here, it's pretty close to me. It's not a very long cut. So I'm really getting a lot of my body behind it and making contact. It's a pretty good angle. It's going to flow through that, drop, come close around behind me, okay, and then repeat this over and over again. Now, if you do this a few times with almost any sword you can do it with, you're going to realize it's pretty good exercise. Can you go the other way? Yeah, sure you can. Different set of muscles, different body mechanic, but again, the idea is to bring it around fairly close behind you. Are there parries to be had here? Absolutely. Level it out as soon as your hand gets in front of your face and cut through. Now again, I'm not an expert and I may well be doing this wrong, but what I've been able to pick up in terms of a useful training device is to be able to do that. Another useful training device, which you might not be practicing in other forms of swordsmanship, is the really close range cutting drill. Now, they will go so far as to find a tree or a post or something like that and put their knee up against it. Okay, I don't have very long anything. But imagine something really, really close to you. What you're trying to do is maneuver the sword through various slashing patterns so that you don't hit the thing that's in front of you and be able to move as well as freely as you can that way. And you'll see I screw it up myself quite a bit because, again, I'm not very good at this. It's a little bit easier, as you see, to do rising or horizontal cuts for me, or use this one, right, than some of the descending ones. For me, some of the descending ones do challenge me a little bit more and don't return as naturally as some of the other movements. One of the things you're going to see when I do a downward cut is I'll either have to bring it back up, and I'll do a video on blade return pass in Japanese swordsmanship. I'll bring it up in the same direction that I cut with from the spine, or I'll bring it around in kind of a parrying action. So you can kind of see that from the front. If I'm going to repeat anything from above, yeah, just like you would with that double-ended stick in your hand. So, a couple of things you can do to potentially get better at this. I would not recommend you go straight out to do cutting with it, because if you've been cutting with any other kind of sword, you're probably going to revert to those mechanics, take that swing, and it's going to go just a little bit too much in the handshake grip, and it's going to hurt. You may even lose control of the sword. So, was that helpful? So you might be asking yourself, especially if you're already used to other forms of swordsmanship, what good is a sword that doesn't have the same kind of reach that a lot of other kinds of swords have and is restricted in how you move it? Well, there are similar arguments about the Japanese style sword as compared to, say, certain European style swords that have a lot more reach. And I would certainly argue that the Japanese sword is fantastic for the things it's fantastic at, which is a lot of stuff. This is kind of in that similar niche category. If you, again, watch people who are good at this, who know what they're doing and are great at demonstrating it, you'll notice they use something, well, I can't do actually in this small space. They compensate with a lot more dynamic maneuvering. They really move their bodies around with a lot of actually circular spinning and jumping and leaping and lunging sorts of movements. They're very, very light and quick on their feet. So they compensate for that range issue by moving in and out and around quickly. This would also be something, for instance, that would be very effective as a cavalry saber off horseback. But if you look at the, well, on the ground use of the weapon, it's usually not used alone. It does have hand protection, not necessarily the most hand protection as compared to certain other kinds of swords that have really elaborate guards, but it's got some decent hand protection. Some have even less than this, though. But the use of the shield buckler in Indian martial arts and the way this sword moves around with a buckler is just really nice. So I would definitely recommend something else in this hand. Now they'll embellish their bucklers with spikes and things, or actually hold a blade like a dagger vertically down to give this even more potential as an offensive weapon. Or they'll use another sword or something else in this hand. But the idea is this is a great weapon to train in conjunction as a pair with something else, because boy, that way, yeah, you can get some really interesting use out of this weapon. And when you think of it, its reach really isn't any different than something like a gladius or a shorter blade like that, or a hanger or a cutlass. So yeah, you might be sacrificing a little bit of reach over a full-length saber, arming sword, side sword, something like that. But for what it's good for, and especially if you're thinking about close-range fighting, yeah, once you get over the restrictions and learn the dynamics of how this thing moves, I find it to be just really, well, appealing, fascinating, and yeah, it's great physical training. So all respect to people who actually know what they're doing with these, because again, I don't really. I'm just kind of starting out and applying what I already know with some basic lessons that I'm picking up. But I hope if you're thinking about getting into something like Indian swordsmanship Talwar, or buying a Talwar, this at least helps you make a more informed decision before you go down the road. Or if you already have one and you're struggling with it, hopefully this helps give you a sense of where to go with it. But again, look up people who are actually good at this, and they should be able to point you down the right path. Anyway, I hope I was, well, somehow useful. And as always, thanks for watching, and hope to see you back for more. Whoops, forgot something. Like I said, I'm not very good at this, but when we're talking about using a weapon like this at close quarters, it's arguable whether that disc gives you hand protection from this orientation, but some of these weapons, as you'll see, this one has a pretty pronounced bolt sticking out at the end of it, and some variations have full-on spikes. If you're talking about using something like this at ultra close range, do not discount what you could potentially do with the pommel. So, stuff to think about.